Hi Terry.
Hey Sarah, how's it going?
It's going fine. So I think before we begin, if we just sort of introduce ourselves a little bit and talk about what we do to set a bit of context, and then we can get on with playing the game and trying to find some inspiration for world-saving games.
Fab, I'm looking forward to it. So, all right.
You go for
that. So I'm Terry Pearce. I work as a bespoke learning designer, particularly focusing on gamification and games-based learning. My company is Untold.
Okay. I'm Sarah Le-Fevre. I also work in games-based learning. I have a business called Games for Good, which specialises in learning around things like climate change and other sort of societal problems. But I also run and edit a monthly, well, soon to be bi-monthly, magazine about games-based learning and gamification called Ludogogy.
Yeah, which I know all about because I write for it. It's fantastic.
Yeah, one of my favourite authors, one of the most prolific.
Cool.
Okay. So I've put together, we both sort of brainstormed a few ideas around potential problems that we might want to look at, big wicked problems we want to look at with games. And we're going to play a little game a bit later on based on that, a card game. But I thought, first of all, it might be a good idea to sort of set the scene a little bit and think about why we're doing this and why we think that games are a suitable way of doing this. Because a lot of people would think that games were quite trivial. And what are you doing tackling big problems with games? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the question is, what about games makes them suitable for learning around kind of wicked problems? I think the first thing is to note is that they're just great for learning. They're great for learning about anything. With a game, you can help yourself because you can make mistakes. And actually that being able to make mistakes and being happy to make mistakes frame is a really good one for learning, and you expect it, I think, within games. And it takes the ego away, as long as it's not too competitive a game, instead of the ego being really present in learning and you're thinking, if I'm getting it wrong, it's a comment on me. You're kind of like, well, my kind of, the way the game is set up, there's lots of other factors. It's not just how good I am at this problem, for instance.
Yeah, I agree. And what you were saying earlier about being able to make mistakes, I think one of the things that's often put forward for using games is the idea that it's a safe space for experimentation. Although I must admit, I've been looking recently because I'm interested in sort of systems thinking and systems design, and particularly interested in climate change. I've been looking at ways to make those spaces less safe because sometimes it feels like games are a little too safe. And obviously a lot of these problems that we're looking at, things like climate change, potential things like pandemics and so on, which we're experiencing at the moment, they're not safe, and maybe we need to be a little less safe with the way we design our games as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
To me, the really interesting thing about games when you're looking at these big problems, because obviously what you're looking at is how you can improve them in the future, and I think games have masses of potential for that, because much like other forms of what you would think of as entertainment, and games are often thought as entertainment, they have that shared ability to conceive of things which don't yet exist. So you can be very kind of, what's the word I want, sort of forward-looking, there is a word, but I can't remember what it is, but you can come up with those productive fictions to actually think about what might be. And that's the thing that's really, really interesting to me at the moment. One of the things that I've been looking at quite a lot recently is transition design. And I think transition design being the idea that designers that we're living in transitional times, particularly with problems like climate change and the pandemic and so on. And I think that's become much more obvious over the last year. The sense of urgency has really increased. And transition design posits that designers of all kinds, whether they're architects or planners or designers of public spaces or public policy, and I think designers of learning as well have that responsibility to start looking at how we can make things better and how we can live within our means and those kinds of things. So that's a really interesting thing. And transition design is, by its nature, a very long-term prospect. So that again, that idea that games allow us to do that looking forward and those productive fictions far into the future, I think it's really useful.
Yeah, you make me think there about the flexibility and the adaptability of games, and the way that by being really open-ended in themselves, they kind of mirror the open-endedness of the problems that we're talking about, and therefore you can explore these things in ways that when you start the exercise, when you start the activity, you wouldn't have anticipated even the way you were going to explore it, never mind the solutions that you were going to reach. And I think for me that also comes out when you talk about play. I mean, we're talking about games, but
Yeah.
when games have as an essential element of them the idea of play, then that idea of playing and moving to the side or going in directions which aren't going straight towards the goal, really can be brought out, because that's the essence of play. And you can start to do all kinds of things that play does well, like get lots of different people involved, which is huge for problems that affect everyone in the world. And also not be overawed by the sheer scale of them. We're just playing about with this. We're not saying we're going to solve it today, but we'll see what comes out of it.
Yeah, and I think sort of the idea of getting lots of people together, games are really, really good for co-design and creation as well, because in any situation where you design a game, whether it's a serious game or just a game for fun, all the game designer can actually do is design the mechanics. They can't design the experience. So there is always that. The player is always part of the experience, and the player creates the experience in play. And that is a really interesting thing to play around with when you're talking about serious games, when you're looking at sort of co-design and creation, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to be surprised by the results. If you're not surprised by the results, then we're definitely not going to solve any of these problems.
Yeah. Which is why we don't want to be creating Monopoly.
Absolutely. We can agree on that. Excellent. So yeah, I think it is definitely a huge step forward to be focusing on this kind of area using games. Should we maybe explain, for the benefit of the video, how we've kind of chosen to do that?
Yeah. So what we've created here is a kind of meta game. It's a game about games design, and there aren't enough of those, in my opinion. There should be more of those. The action of creating games should be more playful in itself. But what we were looking at, we took as our inspiration a couple of games that we sort of came across over the last few weeks. In fact, there was a game called Afro Rhythms, which is a futurism game, which is basically a card game which used cards for stimulus to tell, again, these productive fictions about what might be. And although that's not necessarily what we're doing here, that idea of a very, very simple mechanism that could actually lead to some quite complex storytelling or concepts coming together is what we've come up with here. So we decided to pick 4 different categories of card, which were, one is problems, which are the big wicked problems we're looking at. So you'll see things like racism and climate change and so on in there. Outcomes and experience. So that was really around in play, what did we want either the players to be experiencing, or what did we want them to come out of at the end? What would they experience, or what would their learning outcomes be? We then sort of brought in a number of frameworks and concepts. Now some of these are learning frameworks, some of them are games design frameworks, but some of them are just bits and pieces we've picked up along the way. Things that we like the look of, ideas that really sparked our imagination. And finally, toys, tools and techniques. So these are really, I guess, what would be recognised as things like games mechanisms, games pieces, and so on and so forth. So they all live in there. And I've just been fiddling around with it in Excel to prototype it a bit. So we've got a couple of ways of playing. One of which is just to take 4 random cards and then use our imagination to see what that suggests to us in terms of designing a game. And this is all very, very experimental, and we might be sat here saying nothing, but let's hope not.
Well, I think, based on what we just said, that's part of the thrill, really, is to see what happens, and maybe some magic will come out of it. Yeah,
and the other thing, of course, is I hope my VBA works, but we should soon find out. So I'm going to take the plunge and clip 4 new cards.
Yeah, absolutely. And our
Right.
kind of framing question on all of these was something along the lines, wasn't it, around how can the frameworks and concepts and the toys really help to bring these outcomes or experiences about in terms of these problems?
Yeah. Or what would a game look like if we took all of these and took it as a brief, I guess, is another way of looking at it. So this one's quite topical. Fake news. There's obviously been a lot of fake news around today about Trump and his $750 worth of tax, which apparently, according to him, isn't true. So yeah, we've got fake news, trust, Nicole Lazzaro's 4 Keys to Fun, which we're both big fans of, and balance as a toy or tool or technique. So what might this suggest to us, do you think?
Yeah, this is really interesting. The trust with the fake news is quite an interesting juxtaposition. So I guess maybe there's something there about, how do we get people to trust the news or know what they can trust, but via a game that perhaps is influenced by that.
I mean, that would suggest to me a kind of critical thinking kind of aspect to the game. And as you say, how do people recognise what they should trust?
Balance is really interesting. So, you could start to do a basic thing where you look at the balance between political polls and start to play around with them. Maybe a game asks people to look at particular kinds of news or a particular news article and say whether it seems initially to have a bias towards one political poll or another, maybe. And then you could change that over time or add new things into the equation.
I think one of the interesting things I heard recently was I was watching a documentary about Facebook. It was absolutely terrifying, but that's by the by. But it said that something like 6 times that fake news or disinformation spread 6 times as fast as the truth on social media, which is quite terrifying. So that might be a way to look at the balance. Maybe get people within the game to try and run a social media outlet, and they're trying to redress that balance somehow. Maybe that might be the outcome of the game, that you're trying to somehow. You've got, what do you do as Mark Zuckerberg or whatever within the game? What do you do to redress that balance?
Yeah, and you could have some kind of sliders for different things or some kind of settings, things you were changing, and they had to have different effects on those kind of reproduction rates, the R rate of information. The other thing that just occurred to me when you were talking about that 6 or 7 times as often is that if you just, perhaps even as a first step, if you put people in that position of trying to get a message out, and some players were trying to get a fake news message and some put, a real news message, and actually just get them to actually watch it kind of expand across the map, one 6 times as fast as the other, like a virus replicating.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there would be, if you had a big enough group of people to play, you could really quite experiment with that idea. I think it would be difficult to do as a sort of board game with 4 people around a table, but if you sort of expanded it, so you were doing it within a community or maybe within a classroom, that might be enough people.
I'm just looking at the 4 keys, and I'm thinking we haven't really looked at that yet. Obviously, for anyone who knows the 4 keys, the one that it kind of suggests itself on from what we've been saying and just from the whole framing that we have for this whole game, in fact, is serious fun in a way that it's about changing people's opinions. But I wonder, should we look at whether we could bring on board a little bit more hard challenge-based fun or people social type fun or easy kind of entertainment, more level fun?
Yeah, one of the things, because I saw Nicole Lazzaro I think it was one of the same interviews that you saw with Yukai.
Yeah.
Chao.
Great interview.
And one of the things that I'd never really thought about with the 4 keys before was that kind of figure of 8 pathway between them, that you could start with one and it would kind of lead to the others. So I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and it feels like it's almost like a journey that you could take people through, particularly with these kinds of, because these problems are quite hard You know, if they weren't hard, they'd already been solved.
Yeah.
So it almost feels like you could mirror that idea by starting off with a fairly easy play, easy concepts, and then moving people through the people play, and then the hard play to the serious play.
Interesting.
When you were doing that.
And going back to what we were saying about the kind of perhaps a couple of stages, so you could have an easy one which was just about seeing that difference, you know, the 6 times versus the 1 times kind of reproduction, but then get it into people fun by getting people to compare what they're doing, and perhaps then even into hard fun by challenging them, as you said, to change that rate, to take action.
Yeah, I'm almost saying like almost like a box of cards, like Trivial Pursuit cards. So there's quite a lot of them, and they've got news items written on them. And what you have to do when you pick out the card is you have to decide whether you're going to spread it, or you're going to sit on it, or you're going to check it. You're going to fact check it. So you've got a number of different things you could do with your piece of news.
Yeah. And you need to put some kind of pressure on them so they didn't just always fact check it. Like if it takes some extra time, and that has a resource cost or a trade-off. Yeah.
Well, you get, I mean, much like you just do it like real life, don't you? If you pass it on, you get lots of likes. And likes give you victory points for the end. Yeah. But you've got to balance that against potentially penalties, up to and including having your account shut down.
Yes. Or just people trusting your message less. So perhaps the number of likes they get you at the start is loads, and you start to do it more and more and more and not care about the fake news, but then actually you suddenly notice that now instead of 10 points every time you share, it's now 9 and 8 and 7 because nobody trusts your message anymore.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I like that. That's definitely a potential for a game there.
Cool. Well, I think we're just trying to do kind of, get a few different ones on the go here and get some stubs. So should we switch?
Yeah. Excellent. Do you want to do 4 new ones, or do you want to just get new cards for some of them?
Let's change all of them. We've got a few different things going through. Fantastic. So we've got generational disharmony, which, the whole OK Boomer debate and everything else that's going on around that. Creativity as an outcome. So how do we get people to feel creative around that, perhaps? Silliness and the wise fool. Did you want to say a word about that? Because I think that was one that you popped in there.
So, yes, I came across a quote, and rather stupidly, I didn't write it down. I just wrote the word silliness down. I think it might have been the beginning of the framing play design that we were reading. It might even have been Bernard Suits. But it was something to do with the idea that when you're theorising about play, that it inevitably descends into silliness. But that wasn't seen as a negative thing. It was seen as, silliness is part of play. And that got me thinking about the fool. And I thought, if we're talking about silliness actually being a positive thing when you're theorising about games, then the archetype we're talking about here is the wise fool. And that got me thinking about other archetypes as well. So you could change this card to archetypes if that's easier, because that's probably what I should have put.
The wise fool, silliness, and it's an interesting idea. I think sometimes we discard it too quickly. Yeah. And self-created pieces was perhaps all about. No, go on, you put that one in as well.
Yeah. So. Do you remember I mentioned a game the other day called 1,000 Blank White Cards?
Okay.
So basically, it's the idea that you can that the players create pieces to play with in play, and I do like that idea.
Okay. So we want them to be creative around generational disharmony. So is it creatively coming up with solutions themselves, or is it creatively perhaps trying to put themselves in the shoes of another generation?
Yeah. So how could creativity as an outcome or as an experience help with the idea of generational disharmony? Mm.
I think maybe creativity is useful in terms of perhaps just jumping out of the frame in the first place, because it's quite an artificial frame, you know,
It's
to
it.
say boomers and X's and Z's and Y's and whatnot. You know.
And it does feel very manufactured,
Mm.
because, you know, in my experience, I don't seem to experience any generational disharmony. And I don't know anybody that's actually said they've experienced it firsthand, and yet you read about it all the time.
Mm.
You read about this, you know, simmering resentment that apparently is completely, you know, overwhelming, and all the rest of it. But a lot of it just seems to be something, I could be wrong, a lot of it seems to be something that's certain sections of the media like to talk about.
I think it can be both, though. I think it can be manufactured and also have a kind of reality. I think I certainly have seen and experienced people railing against one generation or another for reasons, but again, it's this whole thing. It's the idea of naming something, and then as soon as you name something and put attributes to it, you're kind of creating it, taking this kind of disparate set of people with attributes and kind of putting them in a box. So maybe the creativity is about getting past those boxes.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, I guess one of the ways to get past it would be to get people to see what they have in common rather than what they have, you know, that separates them. It's not so easy, this one, is it?
Something maybe about self-created pieces there, that if they can create markers, pieces, perhaps even scales, some of the things you might have in a game like the point scale or the attribute scale for characters, if they create them themselves and then start to say, okay, so where does this generation sit on that, almost kind of trapping them into stereotyping and generalizing a little bit, but then asking them to say, okay, so if you're from this, I keep having to not use Generation X as a signifier for X, you know, whichever, because Generation X is a thing.
Generation 2 or something like that, yeah.
Generation A or whichever. If you're from that one, does that stereotype fit you, actually, now that you've created it?
There's a really interesting game that I played, which is kind of it's a mind reading game. So it's got what is it called?
The one where you put down numbers?
No, it's not the Mind, but it's made by the same people who made the Mind. It's made by the same company. So it's like a scale, you know, like an old-fashioned weighing scale type arrangement with two sides on it, and you have to pick out a card. So you play with a partner, and the cards just have a concept on them, and then you have to not mention what the concept is, but you have to say something that's related to that concept. So let's say the concept is, I don't know, people who are good musical artists or something like that. So the idea is that you're trying to get them to agree with you on a scale of where something that you say will fall on that scale. So if it says, you know, good bands or, you know, whatever, and you think that this person that you're with is going to say just about the same thing as you if you say Motorhead. So you position your dial on one side of the the dial's positioned by chance, but then you reveal that and you go, oh right, okay, so it's at this point here, I want to get the person to put it there as well. So I think they would put this band at that position.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not explaining it awfully well.
That makes sense. I've got a 7. I think they rate Motorhead as a 7, so I'm going to say Motorhead.
Yeah. And you get points depending on how close you are to each other. My younger daughter and I are absolutely awesome at this game. Okay. It's like it's like we're the same person. But yeah, I can see maybe something like that, where you could sort of put stereotypes on a scale and then get people to do that.
see if they stereotype the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if they stereotype the same way, or what their self-image is compared to the image that other people have of them.
That's interesting. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure where silliness and the wise fool comes in.
Yeah.
Shall I just, can I get a new card here just to see my
go for it.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you can start to look at the different motivations of different generations.
So what does it mean in your generation to feel safe? What does it mean in your generation to feel self-fulfilled? That might be quite interesting.
Yeah. Maybe the self-created pieces could even be kind of artifacts. I mean, if you had this as a computer game, maybe they could even be creating things, literal things that would make them feel safe and secure, you know, from some kind of item creation menu or sandbox.
Yeah. I don't think this is as interesting a game as the one we had before.
Sure. Okay, we can switch.
Obviously, with a real brief, we wouldn't give up this easily. Having been given this brief, we would persevere until we turned up something good.
Yeah. Epidemics had to happen. Confidence is interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is exactly what's not happening at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm really glad it's brought up Borges' Library of Babel, which is one of my favorite stories, and I think is a great illustration of the concept of infinity, and it's really interesting in terms of the idea that any book, including a transcript of this very conversation now that we're having, exists in this library because it's because it has every single possible combination of letters, characters, spaces, each within its own book. So that's interesting.
So it's, that's a web project now as well, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, no, the web project is really amazing. So you can actually generate any of these books, which means that every book that was ever published or ever will be published is within that web page potentially.
Wow. I guess it's a bit like the monkeys, isn't it?
Yes, Shakespeare's monkeys, exactly. Yeah. And then legacy mechanics. So how do we inspire confidence around epidemics? So yeah, this is really solution generating. You know, how do we get people to be more confident in presumably the response to epidemics by exploring infinity and legacy mechanics?
Yeah, it's a bit hard, sort of like knowing what's going on in the news at the moment. It's a bit hard to get past the idea that what you should be thinking about here is inspiring confidence in leadership through the epidemic, but maybe try and see the confidence in a slightly different way. Like confidence in your own actions, I guess.
That's really interesting. Yeah, particularly in the early stages, I was very unsure about, you know, okay, I thought that this was probably the right thing to do, but not with a high degree of certainty. Yeah. Yeah, and that's really interesting because that's really key.
The Library of Babel is quite an interesting, obviously not literally, but the idea that of having to sort through lots of information in order to get to what you should be doing and what you can be confident in. That would be quite an interesting kind of mechanic to actually sort out the white noise. It's going back to fake news again, isn't it?
To some extent, and actually it would have been interesting if the infinity card had come up in that game. But yeah, maybe if you could have a computer program that was actually kind of generating all the different possible combinations of wear a mask, don't wear a mask in this situation and not in this other situation, go out in this number of groups, see this many people, bubble with this many households. And once you start to get all those combinations and the different ways that people can arrange them to just see the pure multiplicity of options, could be interesting.
And again, I think there's a critical thinking element in here as well, isn't there? Because again, with the news that I've been hearing today about, there's been a big outcry because people have discovered that the House of Commons bar didn't have a 10 p.m. A 10 p.m. curfew, and it's sort of like, oh, okay, all right, so it doesn't, but
I guess, yeah.
It's sort of like you can be a hypocrite and still not be wrong. Not what I'm saying they're right, but you know what I mean. Hypocrisy is neither here nor there. Hypocrisy is a different argument than whether or not you're doing something correctly. I'm not saying that they are, but yeah, but it just confuses things, doesn't it?
Sure. And there is a lot of confusion of message, and I guess that's where the confidence comes back in.
Yeah.
The legacy mechanics. Well, it's hard to think of legacy mechanics and epidemics without thinking about pandemic legacy.
Pandemic legacy. But
we probably better not rehash their ground.
I mean, this is what I was thinking about earlier when I was mentioning that maybe there's an argument for making less safe spaces in games, and legacy mechanics is definitely a good way of doing that. And you know, there are things. I mean, I tend to think about it in terms of climate change, but things like epidemics, there are tipping points beyond which you know, you've gone down an irrevocable route, which is really what legacy mechanics is about. Once you've like burnt your cards or made a mark on the board or whatever, you're stuck with that. So what would legacy mechanics look like in a game about epidemics if we try and do something completely different from pandemic legacy? And again, I'm kind of feeling tempted to think that maybe this is a running the country game.
Yeah.
You're making those decisions.
Should we just see if there's another card beside confidence? See what might.
Another card instead of confidence.
Yeah, just how I might mix things up if there was.
Ha!
Responsibility. That's interesting. Getting people to feel more of a sense of responsibility. I mean, legacy and responsibility is an interesting link, actually. So, you know, feeling the weight of doors closing behind you through the legacy mechanic and seeing what impact that has on responsibility could be quite interesting.
Yeah.
And actually, the idea of doors closing behind you in relation to the infinity, you know, you've got all these possibilities, and actually they're narrowing and narrowing and narrowing until you've only got one timeline. Actually, the idea of timelines is quite interestingly connected to infinity, and that could be an interesting way, based on some of the things we said about games, to explore this. That actually, you know, there's all these timelines where in one timeline, you know, end of the human race. In another timeline, no problem, and everywhere in between. And you know, you could live in any of those timelines, but then you're gradually closing doors, so you end up living in just one of them.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. But let's say let's make this very, very prosaic and practical now. Let's say that you were have been given a brief because we're in some town that's in local lockdown, and we've really got to get to grips with getting people to stop going out partying on a Saturday night, or all gathering outside the pub and then going back to their mates at 10 o'clock because they can't drink in the pub any longer. That element of responsibility. What would that look like?
It feels like there should be perhaps some element of behavioral economics in here to try and say, okay, so perhaps this, I know it's not on one of our cards, but maybe you have behavioral economics and you have a range of impacts, some of the effects that, you know, Kahneman talks about in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, or those kinds of things. Say, okay, so which of these are you going to try and apply to the situation, and how, in order to try and, because that's what it's really about. It's about trying to not
nudge people in the right direction.
Nudge, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So cards are options that might nudge people, and if they're phrased in a way that you know, doesn't make it obvious which is necessarily going to work, and people get a chance to try out one or try out another.
I mean, it feels almost like a sort of branching scenario game, doesn't it? It feels like almost like a fighting fantasy. Yeah,
which again fits well with Warhurst. I just had a little thought there as well about time travel. If you're thinking about timelines, then, you know, with that whole thing of the model of time travel where a new universe splits off, if you go back and change something, you know, then there's something there perhaps about
houses of time, as Terry Pratchett called it.
Sorry?
The trousers of time.
Yes. Yeah, so if you wanted to make it more of a kind of theme of something a bit exciting rather than just kind of civic kind of Sims kind of thing, you could say something about you've gone off and split off this timeline, and all the people in that timeline have had this impact, and you bear the responsibility for that. Try again.
Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, cool. Do you want to try another?
Yes, let's.
I think we've got time for one more, haven't we? We've probably got time
certainly
for a couple more.
Yeah.
Now creating artifacts. I was hoping that would turn up.
Yeah, go on and say a little bit about why you put that card in there, perhaps.
So as you know, I'm a little bit obsessed with futurism at the moment, having been on a really, really good course with Jane McGonigal at Coursera. And one of the things that they do at the Institute of the Future to bring to life, so they do futurism work where they're making forecasts. Again, there's these productive fictions, if you like, of what may come to pass in the future. And it's not just pulling it out of the air. It's based on quite clear signals of things that are happening already. So signals already exist. And they can be expressed in terms of drivers that are driving those kinds of changes that we see around us. They create forecasts based on that. But one of the jobs when you've created the forecast is actually finding a compelling way to communicate that, so that people will actually feel that they want to take action on that, or feel that they want to explore that further. And one of the ways of doing that is actually creating artifacts from the future. So if you imagine that you're just walking along one day and you find this strange looking gizmo, and you pick it up and you examine it and find out that it's actually sort of come through some wormhole from 30 years in the future. But it tells you something, because it's a concrete thing, and it tells you something about how life is in the future in a way that a report wouldn't tell you, or a PowerPoint with we think this is going to happen and so on wouldn't tell you. And yeah, it just seems like a really, really compelling way of telling stories, or or inspiring stories to a certain extent as well. And I've also the other aspect of it, which I find is really, really attractive, is I like making things, and I think a lot of people like making things. And making things activates different parts of the brain from talking about things or writing things down, which just opens up a whole new sort of cognitive pathways, I think, when you're playing games. If what you're doing as an outcome is you're actually making a physical object.
Absolutely. I was just thinking, as you were saying that, and you were talking about these artifacts kind of from different times and so on, and then looking at the world building there and thinking about the link between those two. And I wonder if there's a dynamic there around getting people to build the world first and then build the artifact, but then reversing that process to say, okay, so you got player A, he's got a world, he's built it, or she, and then she's created this artifact from it, and then gives it to player B, but player B knows nothing about that world, and now has to say, okay, so what do I think about that world based just on the artifact, particularly in terms of economic inequality?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And the world building is also a mechanism or a tool that they use quite a lot in futurism as well. And yeah, they're both really interesting. But yeah, something I saw somebody do the other day was there was an artifact, and it was completely unclear what it was. It was just a funny shaped thing with no markings on it. And then you just challenge people and go, what is it? And that's what you could do. You could build the world and say, this is the world. And you say, this thing came from this world. Now tell me about this thing. What is it? That's really, really interesting. And somebody might go, well, it's a mind control device. Obviously, you hold it on your head, and you get sent messages or whatever. Or it could be, I don't know. Well, it could be absolutely anything. It could be a holographic projector, because you can project anything you want onto that thing. And that's a really, really good way of getting at what people are thinking, I think.
I wonder if you could have something there as well, as so there could be quite focused explorations then about things that touched on economic inequality. So you could say, okay, so what kind of person uses this or made it or benefit from it? And then the answers to that could be quite revealing. Sorry?
Who could afford this?
Yes, yeah. The answers could be quite revealing, yeah.
Yeah. And people who can't afford it, what does that mean for them? What can't they do? Yeah. As a result of not being able to afford this, whatever it is.
Yeah. I mean, so far this sounds like a very, very kind of open-ended game, almost play as much as game. Are we happy with that, or do we need to make it more of a game?
I'm very happy with that, because as time goes on, I become more and more convinced that what I want to do is create very, very long-winded, open-ended games. Because it seems like that sandbox, that long-term sandbox kind of format is the real way to get at or to get people to think about what the future could look like, I think, which you can't get in a 40 minutes. We'll take it out of the box, we'll put it on the table. So it's more, I guess, more D&D campaigns that I'm thinking in terms of now, rather than a single session of play.
Yeah, which is fine. And, you can have that on a number of different levels, depending on whether they are physical artifacts or not. You could have it as an ongoing kind of web project that people play. You could have some kind of nod to games-based stuff, have a score or something. Or you could have it as a physical thing, an exhibit, maybe permanent exhibit somewhere.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome.
And then display people's some of the most interesting outcomes from it. Even.
Yeah. I mean, it's certain. I think this kind of game would certainly, and coming to the organisational learning change model, which is very cheekily put in because that's my model that I've made up, that I'm writing a book about. But not to go into it in too much detail. But I think that kind of idea that you just suggested would work very well within an organisation where people are together for a long period of time, or within a school, or within a university, some kind of institution where people are not just coming together for a short period of time, but are together for a long period of time, and can actually get the full advantage from doing a full-scale world build. Yeah,
interesting. Or they could even do one. You talk about world building, but it doesn't have to be the entire world. It could be the world of their industry, or the world, or their place in a future world that their company takes up.
Yeah, I mean, the world they're building could be their organisation. Yeah.
How do we look in the year 2080?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, looking at these, they work together really well, don't they? Because if you were looking at from a point of view, if we sort of limited it to an organisation by saying, well, the organisational learning change model is in here, we're looking at maybe how a business is saying, well, how can we help to alleviate economic equality in the future? What does our world look like if economic equality is no longer a problem? And what features are in that world in order to make that happen? So you could almost look at it, say this is a bank, for example. The artifacts might be financial products.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think what's really powerful about this, and I guess just about artifacts in general, is you're really engaging them to both in the creation of the artifact, but then also in the interpretation of it. You're not spoon feeding them. Everything we said about games, and they're really engaging people's imaginations. They've got to do the work.
Oh yeah,
putting them front and center.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with world building, there are two ways to go. If you're a games designer, you can either design the world for somebody. You can actually be, as it were, a D&D scenario writer. Or you can just give people the tools and go, this is how world building works, now get on with it. Here's the framework, which I think would be my preferred way of going about it.
And I think in this kind of situation that we're talking about, it's going to engage people a lot more. I mean, obviously, as soon as you see that control, you have to live with all these different possible consequences, and you have to be prepared for those. But if you can do that,
no, I'm liking that game. It's a good job we're recording this because I've forgotten what the first game was. I want to build the first game and I want to build this one. They both look like they've got legs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, that's what we kind of anticipated, that some of them would kind of make us think more in a way that it produce more immediate results. And we talked about whether a brief is worthwhile to, and that if we had a specific brief, obviously we wouldn't give up on it. But actually, a brief may or may not specify anything by the first of these. That actually we might have freedom to cycle through many of the red and yellow and green.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. Although I have to say, I have in the past been presented with briefs which really do go down to the level of toys and tools and techniques, and you sort of think that's my job to decide what that looks like. But we definitely want to have this in it, and it's usually because this is the latest funky thing that somebody else has done.
Yeah, more to do with marketing than actual design.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm just wondering whether we should go for one more. We did have some ideas about some kind of specific other ways to use these and bring out some of our own favorites. Maybe in terms of the times that we're taking, we should go on to that.
Okay.
Or we could have another go, do you want?
Should we have one more go?
Okay. We could always cut one of them out. We'll have to at least get that.
Okay. So fake news again. Do you want me to change fake news because we've already had it? Okay. Historic land disputes, including youth turf wars. Agency, Moksuski's Hexad, and Observing the Magic Circle.
Which if we flip, we get another one, I think.
Not Observing the Magic Circle, I would.
Yeah. Oh, no, we didn't. I thought we had a different side to that card, but fine.
Nothing on the other side.
Observing it or not observing it, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And playing with the magic circle is one of my favorite things, actually. I think I was going to mention something about that a little bit later on, but that's interesting.
Well, I think the first thing that sort of comes to mind for me is linking together the blue card and the yellow card. Within the magic circle, as you said, you can diffuse all of that enmity because you're playing a game, and the rules of the game are different from the rules of real life. So I think that potentially this could be a game that sort of hinges on that idea that the magic circle is a special space where stuff that's going on in the real world can't intrude.
Yeah. Makes me think a little tiny bit, just to go old philosophy for a second, about John Rawls and the curtain. I don't know if you know that, the theory of social justice. Kind of is this idea that if you put everyone behind a curtain and said you're about to be born and you draw up society this way.
Oh yeah.
Would you be happy with it not knowing which of the roles as society you would be assigned?
Yeah.
And that just makes me think of the magic circle. You could also almost say, like in the magic circle, arrange things a certain way, and you've taken it away from the specific land dispute or any specific land dispute, but then, been linking it back to real life. Would you then definitely be happy with it, no matter which side of the fence you were on?
I feel like it would be unlikely that it tends to be the thing that if people see that other people have got something better or something more, so it's one of those things which in theory you would say, oh yeah, I'll be happy.
But then there's that difference between, the subjective and objective. When you're subjective, you're like, okay, my land. When you're objective, you're like, okay, what's the best use of the land?
Yeah. So
thinking about all these different player styles, player types, and from Marczewski as well.
Yeah.
Would they all have different ways of dealing with land disputes? They would.
So I guess they would, wouldn't they? You could, rather than necessarily thinking about this in terms of, we have to design a game in terms of these different players, maybe you could get people to work through the scenarios in these different ways. A bit like the Six Hats, I guess. Use it in that sense.
Yeah, which is great in terms of the magic circle, because you're putting them inside the magic circle by saying you have to do it in this way, not in the way you would do it, but in the way that this says. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
how could that all connect with agency? So we want to give them agency. We want to help people embroiled in land disputes to have more agency.
Well, I mean, I would say lack of agency is probably one of the sort of the main causes for these kind of disputes, isn't it? Because if you think,
people on the ground versus the governments, you mean?
Yeah, all the in lots of cases, the people who used to own the land versus the people who now own the land.
Yeah.
And certainly with youth turf wars, lack of agency, lack of power in other parts of their lives is often the reason they engage in these.
Yeah, an opportunity.
Yeah.
So what interesting insight, or how could you, so you set it up so that you say, okay, so the philanthropist versus the disruptor versus the free spirit, they all handle it in different ways. So what?
I mean, maybe we'd not necessarily look at it in terms of the hexad, because obviously that is to do with player types, but just look at that card as a suggestion of playing things with different characteristics, not necessarily those ones. Yeah,
you could almost produce types for approaches, traditional approaches to these problems.
Yeah, so I mean, you just play as it's almost like a role-playing thing, isn't it? Play as the roles within the dispute. So how would you feel about this if you were, an ancestor of these people who are engaging in this land dispute? How would you feel if you were the grandchild, or 7 generations down? How would you feel if you were this person? How would you feel if you were the landowner?
Yeah.
So it'd be almost better if agency was empathy, I think.
Yes, which we can do,
We can do that.
With this. Yeah.
And if I had the list of numbers with me, I could actually do that now, but I can't remember which number empathy is.
But we could, and you keep it within the magic circle by, you're not actually talking about this specific one. You're talking about, one in make-believe land, which has many other characteristics. It's like a pastiche of many of the ones that are either current or through history, but therefore reflects them.
That's an interesting, I don't think that's one we put in our list actually, but we probably should have done, was abstraction as a technique.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is another really good thing about games. Another good way of dealing with intractable problems, because you can remove the heat from them by abstracting them. So you sort of set it on Mars or whatever. And
I think if your audience was anyone that had a connection to these disputes, then you would need to do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Good stuff. I feel like there's some really good stubs of ideas coming out of a few of those, definitely.
Yeah, the last one and the first one, not this one, the one before. The first one, I think I definitely liked.
Excellent. But I think some of the other I think you suggested some questions that would bring some more of these up in a chosen way. And I think there's really real benefit and real value in the kind of randomness. It forces you to think of something you wouldn't have considered. But I think it's also interesting to kind of play, if these were a physical deck of cards you could play, and you could pick out the ones that had held some appeal to you. So we can do some stuff around that, I think, can't we?
So that was sort of one of my questions, actually. So obviously this is a very rough prototype, and it really is just a list of 4 types of things that we've chosen at random, or that get chosen at random. So if we wanted to make this into more of a game, what would we do? What cards? So this is very meta as well. So which of the cards that we put in would you want to apply
to the game itself? I love anything meta, definitely. I'd written down frameworks number 23 and toys number 9.
Framework 23, toys 9. Let me do that. Framework 23 and toys 9.
Which, if I've done my numbers right, it should be, this kind of tension, this play being characterized by orderly and unruly Coexisting Intention, which was again from the book Play Design that we've both been reviewing recently by Sune Gudiksen. And the idea of story. And I was just thinking about how, I was just thinking here about how you could kind of say, maybe this is a little bit towards the unruly side, the way we've been doing it. So by putting it more towards the orderly side, we get some rules or systems in place about how you progress or how you change cards or something like that. And also then,
or even or having hands maybe that you can pick from, so you get a bit more of a choice about what you want to put together. That would be more orderly, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So limit your things in a kind of funnel, your options. I guess the way I was thinking of combining it with story is you could almost do a kind of layout of a journey that you go down. So you could think about a journey either of the game creation or of the player experience. And the different cards that you could play at different stages of that journey could be the structure, which you were allowed to play, or whether you had to play it from your hand, or you could pick up a card or whatever.
That's something we've discussed before, isn't it? Sort of like almost using tarot layouts.
Yeah, with a different deck of cards, one that I'm in the middle of designing actually. But yeah, kind of spreads, progressions. Yeah. That's quite powerful.
I think that's good. So what did I put down? I put down quite a few things here, but I'll make that 0. This thing's behaved itself quite well. I'm very impressed with
I'm impressed with your VBA
skills. So I put down 6 and 28 amongst other things, not necessarily together, but I did put those 2 down. Whoops. So advocacy. So I think that was the idea that part of the gameplay might be advocating certain cards. So there might be an element of play whereby everybody got to play an outcomes card, and you've got to make your case for why your card should be the one that goes down, as opposed to somebody else's. And maybe getting points for that as well to add a bit more sort of gaminess to it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's all kinds of mechanisms that you could get in there to try and kind of measure whose advocacy had been most successful, from points to bidding. Yeah,
voting probably would be the way to go for that, which was another mechanism we had in there somewhere. And Kolb's learning cycle, I was just thinking that to actually have some kind of turn structure, which reflects the idea that you're putting something down, and you're conceptualizing, and then you're reflecting, and then you're building on that. So really kind of what we've done, but I suppose a little bit more formalized, I guess.
I like the idea of a loop there.
Whether that will make it more fun and more gamey, I don't know. It might make it a little bit more boring, in actual fact, now I come to think about it.
Well, I like the idea of a loop that brings in, the idea that you could kind of go back over the same ground and apply new ideas to it. Because I was thinking that as we were going through our version there, that more cycling could be interesting. It's a nice starting point, and we didn't want to get too bogged down in any individual one, but given a bit more time, you could start to say, okay, on a first pass, these are the 4 cards, and then on a second pass, we've changed these ones.
Or I could add a bit of urgency, maybe with some VBA, that the cards only remain visible for a certain period of time, and then they're replaced with the next one.
That's interesting, yeah.
You've got to get your idea in quick.
Yeah. You could add them to your hand if you can think of a good enough idea to do
yes, that. Yeah. Oh yeah, I guess you could, if you can think of a really good idea, you get to take the card.
Yeah.
And so who ends up with the most, a very standard card game thing, who ends up with the most cards at the end is the winner.
Yeah.
I got a couple more. I think I just put in a couple of the toys that I thought were, or toys or tools that I thought were quite interesting. Whoops. And I keep doing that, pressing enter. Yeah, changing goals. You'd have to put in some goals to start off with, because it's not a very goal-centered game at the moment. But if it had goals, which might be, for example, the person who's got the most cards in their hand, or whatever, that working with like Flux to actually change those goals, I think is quite interesting. And I think that's quite interesting in a game that's about ideation,
Mm.
because changing goals might potentially prevent you from getting too far down one path
Yeah.
before you have to change direction and be a little bit more creative.
That could create some really interesting combinations, because if you've gone a little way down one branch and then you've been forced to change and you kind of want it to do more, but you've got some kind of open kind of stubs there that are reaching out, wanting more. But before you try and extend them there, you're forced to go off in direction B and direction C. Then you've got 3 times that, and actually then you can try and connect some of those stubs together with their kind of open ends waiting for something. That's interesting.
No.
I was thinking here about, and it kind of, we kind of discussed it a little bit in relation to one of the examples, but 41 on frameworks is the book by McAfee and Benjovson. The book is called Machine Platform Crowd, and it's about this transition from minds making all the best decisions to machines making many good decisions, sometimes better than humans, given enough data and the right data. Products versus platforms. So products being the thing that's always being sold now to platforms where people can create their own products.
Yeah.
And core being the old style, with the core being the experts, and now crowdsourcing decisions and information.
That's interesting. I've never read this book, but it sounds, as you're explaining that, I'm thinking this sounds very much to me like the stuff I've been reading from Clay Shirky.
Okay.
Cognitive Surplus. And he's written another book, Here Comes Everybody, which is all about crowdsourcing.
Sure.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, sort of like that collective intelligence.
Yeah, I really want to read some of his stuff actually, but so I just thought we could apply that to this and start making it a more collective kind of endeavor. Have people doing it, logging on, perhaps to do it live all at the same time, people who don't know each other, or having it.
Obviously, there's got to be a physical element to it, because remember, this is Spiel, so we are talking board games here.
Yeah. Well, okay, great. And I mean, once you're able to have,
why not combine the two?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And once you're able to have full Spiel again, see how many people you can get all doing it in the same room. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, awesome. So I've got another question for you then. If I clicked on 4 cards and your dream brief turned up, what numbers would those be, so I can put those in? And
okay, so I had 2, 16, 42, and 49.
I think we might have some similarities here. Well, I think in the art racism, yeah. Okay, tell me about that then. What would this game look like, and how would it work?
I was just thinking about, if you wanted to get aha moments with racism, although to be honest, that racism card could also be gender or economic equality as well. But if you wanted aha moments in those kind of things, then the hero's journey could be a really interesting way to do that. And this actually idea was sparked by me seeing in a couple of programs recently, and in the film First Man and in the program Lovecraft Country, the use of Gil Scott-Heron's poem Whitey on the Moon. I don't know if you come across that, which is just
I love Gil Scott-Heron. Revolution will not be televised.
Yeah, but just this idea, and it really made me have an aha moment that this thing that, and I'm not by any means saying that the moon landing isn't an amazing achievement, and I don't think Gil Scott-Heron was necessarily saying that either, but just this switch to start to question exactly who is it on behalf of, and who does it help, to what extent. And again, there are not easy answers to that question at all. But I just thought that that was a really interesting aha moment for me, and I was wondering how you could do it in a game, and just thinking that, thinking of the hero's journey, because it's so classic. Once we start to think of things like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever, and how they represent Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, that if you could get players to create a kind of journey, use kind of choice architecture to engage them in a kind of constructing hero's journey, and then put different avatars through that journey, and start to say, okay, so this just journey that in an abstract sense sounded so great and sounded so there's a really kind of high up, admirable kind of thing. Once you start to play around with avatars, different avatars with different features and from different backgrounds going through it, does it really resonate as much for them? Does it mean something to them? Or avatars for the people who are reading about it, or the audiences as well? Does it mean the same if you start to play around with those avatars?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I was thinking about the hero's journey earlier, and sort of the idea, the split is something that's really interesting to me. The split between the ordinary world and the special world, which the hero goes into and returns from later. And I was thinking about that when I was just looking through the list and thinking that really resonates with the magic circle as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
the special world is when you go into the magic circle, and what happens within there. But yeah, the racism thing and the hero's journey. Another good thing that I saw. I'm not going to go into any detail, but just while I remember it. One of the Afrofuturism things I saw the other day was a talk called When is Wakanda, which is like really powerful. So it's sort of like, we want Wakanda, but when's it going to happen? Well, not until, there's massive decolonization, basically. Yeah. Anyway, so I was just going to I'll put mine in. If you finished. Have you finished?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm waffling and interrupting you.
No, it's good. It's good.
So mine were 1, 12. Sorry, this is the slowest batch. I will come up with a way to automate this, obviously, at some point. So these are my choices. So I put climate change, but it could just as easily have been racism. I was sort of wavering between the two. And what I'm really interested in at the moment is activism, actually getting people not just to sort of know something new or find something out, but to actually do something about it. And my aha moments I've had recently is I've read this really interesting book. Well, it's more of a pamphlet than a book, really, called Ideas, Arrangements, Effects, which has really blown my mind. And I'll explain it in a minute, but I'll return to world building as well. It's one of my favourite techniques at the moment. But Ideas, Arrangements, Effects is the idea behind that is that big ideas, and indeed little ideas, which make up big ideas, are embedded in arrangements, which in turn have effects. And when we think about ideas like racism or misogyny or whatever, generally thinking about the ones we see as negative, and we look at the effects that they have, like women not getting paid as much as men, or the shooting of black men by the police in America, and so on. We look at those effects and we tend to think of those in terms of people. We say, oh no, that person is a racist, or that person espouses that idea and therefore they do this bad thing. And we don't tend to look deeper at the underlying things that might underpin all of that. And the idea behind this Ideas, Arrangements, Effects kind of, it doesn't disassociate people from the equation, but it kind of disentangles where people don't necessarily have a choice to be part of those ideas and those effects. And I'll give you a couple of examples that they gave in the book. So a really, really simple example they gave at the beginning was the arrangement of chairs, which is, learning professionals, we know all about the arrangements of chairs, and that's what they were actually talking about, the idea that if you arrange chairs in lines with the teacher at the front, then it not only sort of says where people should sit, but it also has lots of ideas inherent in it about who has the power and who has the knowledge and how people are supposed to learn, and ideas about attention and all those sorts of things. So that was one of the sort of ideas, or one of the examples they gave. But then I was thinking a bit later on, because I was thinking about it in different terms as well, about toilets. So toilets are obviously a fairly an arrangement we take quite a lot for granted. And we just don't think that they could be any other way, which is often the way with arrangements, because they've become so much part of what we do that we don't think about what they are. But I worked for 4 years on a learning program that was about water quality. And one of the things I learned as a result of that is that it's because of the idea of taking our waste away, which was down to a choice by Edward VII, basically, that we have water closets instead of earth toilets, because he put out an appeal because there was dysentery and God knows what going on in the East End of London. He put out an appeal for an invention or for some kind of way of getting sanitation into sort of the poorer parts of London. And Thomas Crapper came to him with the idea of the water closet. And this other chap who had a much better idea about earth closets also came to him. But Thomas Crapper was much better at marketing and basically said, it will go away. And of course, it doesn't go away. It went into the Thames.
And it's the Betamax of the toilet world.
Yeah. But we're still stuck with it. And what we've got now is an arrangement which basically, and this relates to climate change, I promise you, an arrangement which basically turns, we take nutrients out of the soil in the food we eat, and we should return that. Trying to be sort of trying to be delicate about this, but we don't. Instead of which, we turn those nutrients into waste and pollution. And yeah, it's crazy stuff. But we take the idea of the arrangement of toilet for granted. But the effects that has are very far-reaching, and they're ruining our soil. It's going to end up in a situation where we won't have enough to eat, probably. Yeah. So, and I'm waffling on a bit.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So this book completely blew my mind at the idea that we can start investigating things that we really take for granted, things that are too big for us to see, instead of trying to use the same old ways of getting change done, which don't really work, like protesting, which just, it makes your voice heard, and on occasions it works, but it doesn't work very well, and it can end up with you being put on a list of banned organisations, whether you do it violently or not. So yes, there was that, and along with world building, I just thought that would be a really, really good way of creating a game that allowed people to start exploring the arrangements around them, and how they relate to climate change and resilience around their communities around climate change.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. Maybe you could start to, so you've just taken one example there, toilets, but you could have different ones that once you start to look at them, maybe you flip the card and say, okay, here's the assumption we're making, and then how do we do it differently in our new world that we're building? Yeah.
And toilets have because I mentioned this to my daughter yesterday, and she goes, yes, and we don't have gendered toilets in our homes, but we have those in our public spaces. And if we didn't have gendered toilets, there wouldn't be all this hoo-ha about transgender people using the wrong toilet. And I'm going, oh yeah, I didn't think about that one. So you just take a really, really simple example, and the effects it has are very broad reaching.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. I like the focus. Yeah, that ideas, arrangements, effects are a really interesting one. Those levels, it's almost similar to the iceberg model in a kind of way. You've got the thing poking up above the top.
Yeah. So we've obviously looked at a lot of different ideas and concepts and so on as we've been working through, picking them out at random. But have you got one particular that you'd like to explore and explain in more detail?
Yeah, so if you put 37 in the frameworks.
Yeah.
So this is starting to use some of the more left field ones that are not from game design or whatever. And it's the physicist and writer Carlo Rovelli in his book, The Order of Time. It says, we understand the world in its becoming, not in its being, which is the really quotable quote. But really it's about this idea of people and everything really actually being events rather than things, which really as a concept kind of blew my mind as I was reading his book, is thinking of as person as an event is a great idea, but I guess, you can trace that to kind of Buddhism and so on. But even thinking of mountains as events, or anything as an event rather than a thing, which brings you to start to think about the fact that it has a beginning, it has an end, it changes, it progresses, things act on it, it acts upon other things. And I just think that's a really interesting idea, and one that I would love to bring into kind of games and into learning. So if we start to think of that and try to start to visualize that time scale, and to almost try, think of yourself in 4 dimensions, the fourth being time, or any kind of thing in that fourth dimension, then you can start to think about some of the issues that we've talked about. If you were talking about climate change, or about going back to, we're talking about land disputes, then you can talk about the progression of it and visualize that, rather than being so focused on the now. And you can also look, and this maybe relates to what we were saying about the kind of the hero's journey and the flip and the kind of magic circle thing, between the fixed past, where the shape of it over time is fixed because we don't have time machines, but then to the future shape of it is actually spreading off in all these different directions, because we don't know which future we're going to be living in.
Cone of possibility.
Yeah, so that kind of visualization, I think, which could allow for a lot of exploration, a lot of playing around with it, seeing what your role is, and what your action could have at that possible future.
Cool. Excellent. Well, I think I've certainly got, from this session, I've certainly got a lot to go and think about, and I think probably got 2 games I want to work on now.
Yeah.
So,
and this tool as well, I think this tool in itself, I'm going to be playing around with this plenty, and this is just our first draft of this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it works, doesn't it? It works quite well. Yeah, maybe push it out into the community, the other Ludogoggers, and get them to add bits to it. Or
yes,
quite interesting.
Crowdsourcing.
Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant.
Did you want to sort of say where people can get in touch with you?
I'd love to hear from people. Anyone who's listened to this and any of the ideas that we've thrown about and would like to kind of have more discussions about them. As you can probably tell, I love discussing this stuff. So I am on www.untoldplay.com. That's my website, and you can sign up to my mailing list there, or just contact me at terry@untoldplay.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. You can probably find me in Terry Pearce, or if you search for Terry Pearce Untold Play. I'd love for people to get in touch.
And me too. Probably the best way to get hold of me is at ludogogy.co.uk. So Sarah with an H at ludogogy.co.uk. Always looking for writers for articles for the magazine. So do drop in there and have a look and see what we do there. It's all to do with games-based learning and gamification. And likewise, look for me on LinkedIn. Sarah Le-Fevre, with a rather strange hyphen between the Le and the Fevre. And I'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. It's been really, really great discussing some of this stuff with you today, Sarah.
Okay. Cheers. Thanks. Bye.